Hey traders, it's John Fortune here of this week's Weekly Forex Forecast. We're going to run through over 30 markets in today's video, but just remember, I'm not looking to trade every market we look at. So as we go through the charts today, I will be building out a watch list along the way so you can see exactly what markets I'm personally interested in trading next week and what pairs I think are the best going into next week. So I hope you're all having a nice weekend. Let's jump over to the charts and see where the money is this week. Total number of trending markets this week is up to 39% from 25%, so we're seeing the markets continue to start to trend and turn the corner after being corrected for the last 3 weeks or so, and this means more opportunities are coming back into the market. I personally only look to trade 1 to 3 trades if the total number of markets is under 50%, and once we start to get over 50%, we get more opportunities. I look to increase my risk to 3 to 6 trades. So I will still only be looking to trade 1 to 3 trades, but it is interesting to note that the markets are beginning to pick up after a period of consolidation. Knowing when there's lots of opportunities and when to risk more in the market and restricting your trading when there are less opportunities in the market is very, very important, and this is a very good mechanical way to do that. So starting with the DXY, I am bearish on the DXY going into next week. We have been declining, and as you guys know, I've been talking about the DXY coming down to the 88.46 in the bigger picture for a while now, and I think it is making its way down there. At the moment, we're just seeing a bit of a correction, a bit of a pullback after a number of weeks trending down. So I wouldn't be too surprised if next week was kind of neutral in the DXY and it started to roll over the following week. But overall, I do only favor short positions in the DXY, so that means in the dollar pairs themselves, I am only favoring and interested in dollar short positions in the DXY pairs next week. Next is crude oil. On last week's watch list, there were 6 markets which I identified as the best looking pairs, and 5 of them went to their targets, performed very nicely. Only pound dollar didn't, which we will see kind of move sideways. Crude oil was one of them. It took out its target 65.42 to the pip last week, and I like this market again going into this week. So what I'm looking for in crude oil this week is any corrections we've already started to get is simply viewed as another opportunity to look for bullish reversals in this market up towards the next key resistance, the upside and the target set at the 67.24. Next is euro-dollar. Now last week euro-dollar just missed the target set at the 1.2155, and going into this week I don't think this market looks as good as it looked last week. The dollar pairs in general are not my preferable pairs going into this week. The Canadian dollar pairs and the Japanese yen pairs are my favorite pairs going into this week, as we'll see as we go through the video. Looking at euro-dollar, I don't think this is a great market. If you are looking to trade this, I would only be looking for long positions up towards the 1.2155, but I think I'm going to give euro-dollar a pass going into next week. Pound dollar was the only market highlighted last week which didn't work out, and as you can see, this just would have been a small loss if you'd taken this from around the open last week. Going into this week, my 2 options on this market are to either short it to the 1.3707 or do nothing. Because I have a bearish bias on the dollar, I will prefer to do nothing in this market next week. US dollar yen. Now I do like yen weakness as a theme going into next week, but the problem is the US dollar is also kind of a weak currency, so we've got 2 weak currencies against each other here. So my options are either to short this down to the 108.20 or do nothing, and I think there are better markets out there. I would prefer not to get involved in this market personally next week. Aussie dollar structured to the upside, so I can either buy it or do nothing next week. The interesting thing about Aussie dollar is it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4 and a 5th wave from the low down here, and what this means is that if we come down and we break the 0.7690, this would be a confirmed double top, and it's likely therefore we get this A, B and a C before we start to continue higher. So this gives us information not just on Aussie dollar but the dollar pairs in general. I would not be surprised to see the dollar pairs kind of corrective next week, and I do think primarily the better place to place your money would be in the CAD pairs and the yen pairs. So going into next week, I don't think this is one of the best markets, so I think I'd personally rather trade other markets than Aussie dollar next week. New Zealand dollar. Last week this was a good market. We took out the 0.7268. As it stands, it's currently structured to the upside, so I can either buy it or do nothing. We're very close to reversing. Once we take out the 0.71460, I will only be able to sell this market or do nothing, and I would prefer to wait for it to do that, and you could look for the right shoulder, and then once the right shoulder is posted and you start to get a reversal, that would be the next move down. The only problem is, as it currently stands, have a bearish bias on the dollar, so any shorts in New Zealand dollar would be strong dollar. So again, I think there are better markets out there to trade next week. US dollar Swiss franc. Last week we took out the target at the 0.9102. Going into this week, it's not on the watch list. I think there are better markets, but it is probably the best one out of the ones we've looked at so far. So if you were looking to trade this, we've started to pull back already. This would be the area to start to look for bearish positions down to the next key of support to the downside and target set, and the 0.9029. US dollar CAD, this was a fantastic market last week, probably the best performing market, and I did highlight this as one to watch to the downside. We took out both targets to the downside, and it is on the watch list once again this week. This is a market to keep your eye on. I think we could get further declines in this market. We are very close to the next target, so any correction in this market would be viewed as a great opportunity to look for bearish entries down to the next key of support to the downside. And I think because we're so close already, we could very well come down to target 2 next week at 1.2137. Next is gold. Now I quite like gold, even though it doesn't make the watch list next week. It's structured to the upside, so I can either buy it or do nothing with this market next week. I do have a bearish bias on the dollar, and we've been through the dollar pairs, and you can see the only one I really like and is on the watch list is US dollar CAD to the downside. So I think that's the best market if you want to represent that view of dollar weakness next week. But after that, I think gold is the second best market, followed by US dollar Franc. So any pullback in this area can be viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish entries up towards the next key of resistance, the upside and the target set at the 1807.87. So those are my favorite dollar pairs going into next week. And as I said, I don't think dollar pairs is where the best opportunities are going to be next week. I think they're going to be in the CAD and the yen pairs, which we have coming up right now. Euro yen, this was one I highlighted last week as one to watch the upside, and it was a really good market. We took out both targets, finishing the week at the second target at the 131.980. And you can see if you just bought this in or around the open last week, this would have been a great trade. Going into this week, I do like this market once again. It is on the watch list as one to watch. We've broken out of this sideways correction now with momentum, and we should just really be looking for a pullback before further advances to the upside. So any continued pullback in this market will once again be viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish positions on this market up towards the next key of resistance, the upside and the target set at the 132.78. Franc yen, this market has been very choppy recently, but we started to break out to the upside of this corrective move with momentum, and this chart is pointing towards high highs next week. So any pullback in this market would be viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish positions up towards the next key of resistance, the upside and the target set at the 120.79. This market does go down on the watch list next week as one to watch. Pound yen broke to the upside last week with this double bottom pattern, and we confirmed it by breaking the high over here, and we've started to pull back, we've started to flag here. So very simply put, going into next week, this is one to watch to the upside. I do quite like this market. Any continued correction towards the 149.94 is viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish entries up towards the next key of resistance, the upside and the target set at the 152.86. Aussie yen, I highlighted this as one to watch to the upside last week, and we had a really nice move from the open into the target at the 84.65, and that was pretty much the move in this market last week. Going into this week, I like this market once again. It does make the watch list, and the Aussie against the yen, a commodity currency against safe haven asset, fits nicely with stocks rising and also the sell-off we're seeing in the DXY, because the DXY, of course, is a safe haven asset as well. So going into next week, any correction in this market will once again be viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish entries up towards the next key of resistance, the upside and the target set at the 85.41. CAD yen is on the watch list this week, and it is one I like to the upside because we're seeing strength in the Canadian dollar against a number of pairs, with crude oil rising to the upside. And the yen is also quite weak, so CAD yen to the upside is definitely one to keep an eye on for next week. Any correction in this market would be viewed as a great opportunity to start to look for those bullish entries up towards the next key of resistance, the upside and the target set at the 90.02. New Zealand yen, I said to you guys last week this was a market to watch to the upside, and we had a really nice rally from the open, taking out both targets, and we finished the week right at the second target, almost to the pip. That was the high of the week. Going into this week, I do like this market once again. It is on the watch list. We're getting a correction, so any further correction is simply viewed as another opportunity to look for bullish entries in this market up towards the next key of resistance, the upside at the 79.59. Euro Franc recently highlighted the 1.107 as a reversal area to look for the 1.0956, and this market's working quite nicely. I think there are better markets out there to trade next week. I would only short this market if I were looking to trade it I think the biggest takeaway from this is that the euro is weaker than the franc. So if you're looking at dollar pairs, for example, US dollar franc to the downside would be a better bet than euro dollar to the upside next week. So if you are looking to trade this, any correction in this market would be viewed as the opportunity to look for bearish positions down to the next key of support to the downside and target set at the 1.0956. Euro New Zealand. Euro New Zealand is structured to the upside, so I can either buy it or do nothing, and I think I'm going to do nothing on this market next week. Reason being, we failed to make a high over here, and we failed to make a low over here. So what we have is we have a lower high and a higher low. This is very often a precursor when you get this to a triangle pattern. And if the market is going to coil and be that corrective, I'd rather stay out of it. I'd rather trade the markets with momentum like the yen pairs that we've already looked at. For those reasons, I'll be leaving this market going into next week. EurUsd. My advice on this pair has been to stay away from it recently, and you can see this has been a very good plan because this market has gone nowhere. It's very, very corrective. Why? Because the dollar's selling off and the two main beneficiaries are the euro and the Aussie. So there's no volatility in this market. It's just corrective. Going into this week, I can either buy it or do nothing. I will be doing nothing on this market, and I don't recommend this as a good market at all next week. Euro pound. Euro pound is starting to get a bit choppy. We stopped just short of the target and we really failed to break very far above the previous high. So going into next week, there is not much between the euro and the pound in terms of currency strength. They're both fairly evenly matched. I think this could get quite choppy next week. If you are looking to trade it, I would only be looking to go long or to do nothing. But I do personally think that next week I'm more likely to do nothing on this market, and I will be focusing primarily on those CAD and yen pairs. Euro CAD, really nice sell-off to the downside. We have very strong momentum in this market. I think lower lows are a very high probability next week. This does go down on the watch list as one to watch. I'll be keeping my eye on this, looking for short positions in this market. Any correction would be great and would be viewed as a great opportunity next week to start to look for bearish entries down to the next key of support to the downside and the target set at the 1.4686. Pound franc. Pound franc is almost taking out the target at the 1.2575 set from last week, and although it doesn't make the watch list, pound franc to the downside, the same as euro franc to the downside, are actually not badly structured. They actually look quite nice. So again, it just confirms what we discussed, which is outside of the CAD and the yen pairs. If you are looking, for example, to the upside, franc yen to the upside, US dollar franc to the downside, is probably not a bad idea next week because the pound is declining against it and also the euro is declining against it. So going into next week, the opportunity to trade this market to the 1.2575 looks to have already passed. So I'd expect it to take out this target and start to pull back. And any pullback would be viewed as a second opportunity to look for moves down towards the next key of support to the downside and the target set at the 1.2366. Pound Aussie, structured to the downside, so I can either short it or do nothing next week. And Pound Aussie is very choppy for the same reason Euro Aussie is, both benefiting from that dollar decline. So I'm personally going to leave this market next week. If you did want to trade it, it would be for shorts down to the 1.7695. I would personally stay away from it. I think there's better markets out there next week. Pound CAD, really big move to the downside, and we have some really nice momentum in this market. It doesn't make the watch list, but I wouldn't be surprised to see further declines this week in pound CAD. It does underscore the fact if you're looking to trade the dollar pairs, for example, US dollar CAD to the downside is in all likelihood going to be much better than pound dollar to the upside. So going into next week, if you are looking to trade this market, any pullback would be viewed as the opportunity to start to look for bearish reversals down to the next key of support to the downside, the target set at the 1.6812. Pound New Zealand, structured to the downside, I can either short it or do nothing next week, and I'm probably going to do nothing in this market because both the pound and the New Zealand are benefiting from that dollar decline, so the market's just very, very choppy. There's not much volatility, so there's not much opportunity. So if you are looking to trade this, it would be to the downside, to the 1.9058 that I would be looking to trade this, but I think there are much better markets out there next week. Aussie franc is structured to the downside, so I can either short this market next week or do nothing. With that being the case, it confirms once again that outside of the watch list pairs of the Canadian dollar and the yen pairs, the Swiss franc pairs are probably your next best bet in terms of opportunities next week. And with the Aussie, the euro and the pound structured to the downside against the franc, it also shows that within the watch list pairs, franc yen to the upside, as I said before, US dollar franc to the downside, etc., is going to be quite a good thing to keep an eye on for next week. So any pullback in Aussie franc would be viewed as an opportunity next week to look for bearish reversals down to the next key of support to the downside, the target set at 0.6990. Aussie CAD on the watch list next week as one to watch to the downside. We have really nice momentum. What I would like to see is any correction, because we're quite close to the target next week, would be viewed as a great opportunity to look for bearish entries in this market, down to first of all the 0.9434. And if we can break through here, and we're very close, so there's a good chance we come down to the second key of support to the downside and target 2 next week, the 0.9329. Aussie New Zealand took out that target to the downside last week at the 1.07180. I do have a bearish bias on this market. I can either short it or do nothing. The main takeaway from this market really is that the Aussie is weaker than the New Zealand. So when you're considering, for example, positions against the yen or against the CAD, something to bear in mind for next week. Any pullback, as we're currently seeing, is viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish reversals in this market, down to the next key of support to the downside at the 1.0679. So again, not a bad market, but I think there are better markets out there next week. New Zealand CAD, really nice sell-off to the downside, really strong momentum in this market, and I think there's a very good chance next week we take out the 0.87430. So it does go down the watch list as one to watch, and any pullback is going to be viewed as a great opportunity to start to look for bearish entries in this market, down towards the next key of support to the downside, the target set at the 0.8743. New Zealand Franc doesn't make the watch list, but we started to break out of this corrective pattern here, and we do have some nice momentum. So again, outside of the watch list pairs, the Franc pairs actually look quite good for next week as well. Any pullback in this market, therefore, would be viewed as an opportunity to start to look for bearish entries, down to the next key of support to the downside and target set at 0.6486. And last but not least, CAD Franc. CAD Franc is structured to the upside. I can either buy it or do nothing, and I do quite like this market to the upside next week. It does make the watch list, and any correction in this market would be viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish entries up towards the next key of resistance, the upside, and the target set for next week at 0.7504. So that is it from me for this week, guys. Those are the markets that I'll be focused on trading next week. Outside of those, I do think the Franc pairs are actually the second best and probably worth keeping an eye on as well. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, please let me know by liking, sharing and subscribing. A big thank you to everybody who does that on a regular basis, and a big thank you to everybody who has subscribed to the channel so far, and everybody who comments and likes and shares on a regular basis as well. So I want to wish you all a fantastic week next week, and I want to wish you all a nice weekend. The only thing left to say is take care and don't forget to trade safely.